We began this semester by defining rational argument as a claim that's backed up with data and expressed by reasoning or warrant. That three-part structure, claim, data, warrant, that gives us the definition of rational argument also reminds us that sometimes rational arguments can be corrupt or can be deceitful and false. Remember, fallacies can be presented as rational arguments. In the context of our public deliberation, we believe that rational arguments are what move people to various different collective public opinions. And so our values are shifted in this long deliberation, not through a single one-instance persuasive argument, but through a network of connected arguments. And our hope is that even where arguments are fallacious or otherwise deceitful, a network of rational arguments, a web of deliberation, will help weed out those ineffective or unethical arguments and help demonstrate what the truth is or what the positive opinions of the collective majority might be. However, to hold this opinion of rational argument requires accepting a few premises, which might not always be true, and indeed are very idealistic in and of themselves. The first premise this requires you to accept is the idea of political equality, or the idea that each person has political efficacy. We previously defined efficacy as the ability to make change or the ability to recognize your own agentic potential. Toward that end, we might note that many people in the United States don't vote because they don't feel like their political opinion even matters. They might not have political efficacy. The hope is, as we think about ways to inspire ethical and effective deliberation, we're able to encourage those individuals to recognize their capacity to be involved in the conversation in a way that creates change. But we might also note that's not always as so idyllic as it claims. The second thing we might need to believe in if we want to espouse rational argument in a public deliberation is the idea of majority rule, or the idea that there might be instances where we simply don't know what to do and we're stuck between 3 or 4 decisions. We have to be able to make action and we have to be able to move in the face of uncertainty, and toward that end, we'll choose the heuristic or the pragmatic principle of falling to the majority's vote to be able to determine those sticky situations. And finally, if we want to have ethical and effective public argument that utilizes rational arguments, we need to be able to engage people who have differences of opinion, and we need to be able to respect those differences of opinion. Toward this end, we should be able to encourage and respect dissenting opinions, because as scholars of critical thinking and as people who study communication, we know that those alternative opinions and those diverse perspectives often enrich and enlighten the very focus of our study. However, when thinking about the history and progress of American democracy, it unfortunately isn't often that we find it being registered or built through consensus. Oftentimes, it's because individuals stood up against the face of the majority and made convincing and compelling arguments to turn the tide of the majority, to recognize the errors of their way, and to accept advancements and rights for the minority opinion. Indeed, that's what we might think about the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, or indeed the civil rights movement, or even today as we discuss Black Lives Matter, as movements that all seek to make an argument from the minority perspective to change the majority opinion. This creates a consensus challenge. If the goal of deliberation is to invite everybody together and to create commonalities of opinion, how do we understand the history of our arguments about values that are so often predicated on individuals who've had to outsize themselves to make arguments at the majority? When we think about how individuals who've had to make those difficult arguments build their arguments, we often identify them as using what's called a prophetic voice. The prophetic voice uses 2 different strategies to be able to move people's value positions. The first is to identify shared values. You might think about how abolitionists often made arguments associated with religion. At the time, religion was deeply woven into the history and politics of the American government, and so it made sense to make arguments to suggest that slavery was wrong based on religious and moral and ethical grounds. But secondly, you might think about how the prophetic voice uses a particular tone to argue that we come from a particular value system that we all collectively share. We believe in freedom, we believe in equality, and we believe in liberty. And if you believe in these things, we argue with certainty and conviction that there is no 1% of doubt for liberty. We're not going to give some instance of slavery or some instance of human trafficking. Those are abhorrent, objectionable crimes at every level and in any instance, and they cannot be standed for. There is no allowing for a minority opinion from that. And so, toward that end, these arguments from the prophetic voice demand change regardless of the majority opinion and demonstrate the minority opinion is correct because of its convictions and because of its values in ways that hopes to change the tide of the majority opinion. So you might be starting to observe the second paradox we'll cross today, and that's what we might term as the democratic paradox. That is, although it is necessary to inspire and move democracy towards progress, If we think about the action of the prophetic moral voice, it truly works against so many of the ethics we think about in the context of public deliberation. The prophetic moral voice problematizes political equality by arguing that not everybody has equal access to political efficacy. The prophetic voice refuses the will of the majority by arguing that individuals who are in the majority opinion are wrong and hold that opinion because of biased or incorrect bigoted values. And the prophetic moral voice refuses to compromise. It doesn't put up with dissenting opinions, and it doesn't respect difference. There's nobody who can say, okay, but just some slavery? No, absolutely not, right? The argument being made through the prophetic moral voice is we don't accept these forms of abhorrent value behaviors. There is a one-way change. It's all or nothing. And certainly that refusal to compromise and that recognition of the unequal political playing field certainly challenges some of the standards of deliberation, but yet remains the essential movement for democracy. And so there's a paradox between consensus, democracy, and deliberation. If we ask ourselves how democracies resolve this paradox, the answer is that just like in resolving fact-based arguments or in resolving policy-based arguments, they turn towards cases. We've previously defined cases as interconnected sets of arguments. Indeed, at this point in the semester, you've built a policy-based case that included a dossier of a considerable amount of research and evidence, and a presentation that helped you exclaim that evidence. Similarly, when we think about the way that we make arguments about values, there are already pre-established methods for determining values, whether those be things like interpersonal private conversations about the values we might ascribe to being a good romantic partner, and the way that we are learned those through Disney or through our conversations with friends, or whether those be more technical conversations about the values associated with research and the way that we might do effective studies with surveys and various different experiments. Those are all set up through what's called the Institutional Review Board that determines what the effective values are. Or if we think about them in the context of politics, we might talk about the way that our political debates often bring up conversations about values as it relates to things like gun control legislation, as it relates to things like healthcare in America, or as it relates to things like our overseas foreign policy. Each of those things have various different value implications that are sorted out at various different fields and methods. However, in any instance, values arguments, whether they're private, public, or technical, are always focused on what we might understand through an Aristotelian term known as phronesis. When we think about phronesis, Aristotle describes it as practical wisdom. It's the ability to discern what is the right value from the wrong value, the right behavior from the wrong behavior, ethical from unethical, comes from an inner sense, a sense of phronesis, a sense of practical wisdom, a sense of good advice, a sense of knowing right from wrong. As politicians and as technical spheres, or even as individuals and roommates or in relationships make arguments about values, they're adjudicating what is the most effective phronesis. And of course, as we've noted, scholars of communication and those who study persuasion believe that the most effective public moral arguments and the best way to consider and change values through a public sphere argument is to consider those ways in which this affects all individuals and seek to invite all individuals into the conversation by making the materials accessible to them and by making the conversation understandable to those participants.